My parents gave everything to my sister and expected me to give her my room too. When I refused, my mother stared at me and said, "Family helps each other. Don't be selfish." I smiled and replied, "I understand," and left. But days later my parents were at my door begging. I'm 31 years old, a lawyer, and I never imagined I'd find myself in this situation. I've been living with my parents in the city for a year, but not because I can't afford rent or because I'm going through a hard time. The truth is, I bought this house. I pay the mortgage, the bills, the food. My parents don't contribute a cent, but if you ask my mother, she'd say it's the least I can do for them. Since I was little, they taught me that family comes first. Good children help their parents. My mother would tell me every time I refused to do something I didn't want to. Like that time when I was 12 years old and I saved for months to buy a bicycle. But before I could, my mother looked at me with disapproval and said, "Your cousin Camila doesn't have one. How do you think she'll feel if she sees you with yours?" In the end, I ended up giving my money to Camila. Since then, I knew that if I wanted to avoid feeling guilty, I had to do what was expected of me. And that's how I ended up here supporting my parents, because that's the right thing to do. My parents, Carolina, 51, and Juan, 54, are retired teachers. After a lifetime in the countryside, they decided to move to the city because they wanted a change of scenery. Or at least that's what they told me. The truth is, I didn't ask for it or decide it. My mother planned it and I just paid the bill. We moved into a 3-bedroom house in the city. It's not a mansion, but it's big enough for everyone. The only thing I made sure of was keeping the master bedroom. After all, I was the one paying the mortgage. The initial plan was for my parents to live peacefully in their retirement while I worked from home in my office. Everything seemed to be in order until my mother decided something for me again. One morning, while we were having breakfast, she dropped a phrase as if it were no big deal. "Your sister Laura and Tomas are thinking of moving to the city. Laura's pregnant and they really need help. They're not doing well in their town." Laura, 30, and her husband Tomas, 33, were always one of those couples who jump from problem to problem. They weren't broke, but they never managed to stabilize. But as soon as my mother mentioned the pregnancy, I knew trouble was coming. Still, I thought maybe they would move and get their own apartment. How naive I was. A few days later, my mother sat me down with her sweet tone but with that urgency that always meant she had already made a decision. "We've invited Laura and Tomas to stay with us for a while until they get back on their feet." She didn't ask if I agreed, she informed me. "It'll only be for a while," she insisted. "Family helps each other." I nodded, convinced that as soon as they found their own place, everything would go back to normal. But the truth is, they never planned to leave. A week later, Laura and Tomas arrived with their suitcases and an attitude that said it all. They didn't look like temporary guests. They looked like the new owners of the house. And that was the real beginning of the disaster. I was still processing everything when Laura and Tomas arrived with their bags in hand. I, the one who paid absolutely everything, food, bills, mortgage, now had 2 more people to take care of. The tension in the house began to build immediately. No one bothered to ask me if I agreed with them moving in. They arrived as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Family comes first," I repeated to myself, although deep down I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. Laura has never been the most responsible person. She always gets into complicated situations and expects others to bail her out. And Tomas, well, his entitled attitude irritated me. He's not a bad person, but he acts as if we all should adapt to his needs. Without a doubt, he reminded me of my mother. When I was 16, I got my first part-time job to save money and buy something I really wanted, a laptop. But when I finally had the money, my mother looked at me and said in a severe tone, "Your sister needs it more than you. You can work and get another one." In the end, I gave the money to Laura. And here I was again. Apparently, my needs were always secondary to my sister's. Just a few days after their arrival, Laura began to drop little comments, those that seem harmless at first but soon become annoying. "This house is so big, it must be difficult for you to clean it alone," she said casually. Or worse yet, "I can't wait for the baby to be born. We're going to need a lot of space for all his things." First I let it go. I didn't want to fight. But then came the bomb. One night after a tiring day at work, Laura and Tomas asked to talk to me. Maybe they would finally admit that they were taking up too much space and that they had been eating everything without even offering to contribute, I thought. But no. Laura, with her usual carefree attitude, blurted out, "We've been thinking, and it would make more sense for us to keep the master bedroom." I stared at her, completely stunned. "We need more space," Tomas added in an absurdly calm voice. "The baby is going to need a lot of things, and your room has the walk-in closet and the private bathroom." I felt my blood boil. My name is on the deed of this house. I'm the one who pays every bill, every expense, without asking for anything in return. And now they wanted me to give up my bedroom? It took me a moment to process it. "Why don't you just stay in the guest room?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "It's quite large and already prepared." And then their audacity hit me full force. "But that room doesn't have a walk-in closet," Laura replied with complete naturalness. "And the baby is going to need space." I looked at her for a few seconds, feeling my patience wearing thin. Finally, I spoke in a firm voice without raising my tone. "I'm not giving up my room." Tomas seemed surprised. He surely expected me to give in, but it wasn't going to happen. "You can stay in the guest room or find another place to live," I said, making it clear that the conversation was over. Laura looked at me offended, as if I had just insulted her. And at that moment I knew this wasn't going to end well. After that uncomfortable conversation, in which Laura and Tomas had the audacity to ask for my room, I thought that perhaps upon reflection, they would realize how ridiculous it sounded and back down. I mean, who in their right mind asks the person who pays absolutely everything to simply abandon their own space? But of course that's not what happened. In the following days, I began to notice signs that the situation was getting worse. Laura and Tomas were getting comfortable. They left their things lying around the living room, their shoes next to the sofa, and Laura was already talking about where she was going to put all the baby's things, as if the house belonged to her. The feeling that something was going to explode grew with every minute. One afternoon I had to go to the office for important meetings. I normally work from home, but I returned at lunchtime to eat something, and that's when I saw it. As soon as I entered, I noticed my things scattered in the hallway. My heart began to beat faster. My clothes were piled on the floor and my computer monitor was there, unplugged, as if someone had been in the middle of a move. I walked with firm steps to my room, and there was Laura packing the rest of my things. I couldn't believe it. She wasn't even startled to see me enter. She barely glanced at me and said with complete naturalness, "Oh, hi. I'm almost done." I felt my blood boil. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, not caring about the volume of my voice. But Laura acted as if nothing was happening, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Mom said we could start moving in here. The baby is coming and we need the space." My anger increased. My mother, who didn't pay a penny of the mortgage, had decided on her own that Laura and Tomas could take my room. Didn't surprise me. Since I was a child, my mother had always found a way to make me feel guilty for not giving in to Laura. "You're the oldest, you must learn to share," she would tell me when Laura took my toys without asking. "You have to help your sister, she needs it more." I wasn't going to let this happen again. "No," I said, advancing towards the room. "I already told you, you can stay in the guest room." Laura crossed her arms and gave me a look as if I were the one being irrational. "That room is too small for the baby, and it doesn't have a walk-in closet. We need more space." My voice rose, unable to contain my frustration. "I'm the one who pays the mortgage. I'm the one who maintains this house. You and Tomas don't contribute absolutely anything. If you need more space, you can find your own place." Laura didn't back down. On the contrary, she seemed more irritated. "Mom said it was okay," she repeated, as if that settled the argument. That's when I completely lost control. I stormed out of the room, my heart racing, furious. I wasn't going to allow them to walk all over me in my own house. With a firm step, I grabbed my phone and called my mother. "Mom, did you tell Laura and Tomas that they could move into my room?" There was a long silence on the line, as if she didn't know what to answer. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Well, I thought it would be the best solution. They need the space and you already have the office. It's not like you're using the room that much." I couldn't believe it. "Are you serious?" I blurted out, unable to contain my indignation. My mother tried to appease me by saying it was no big deal and that we're family, but I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. "I pay the mortgage. I pay for all the groceries. I pay the bills. And you think it's okay for Laura and Tomas to just take over my room? My voice resonated in the house, charged with fury. By that time, Laura must have heard the argument because she came storming out of her room. I'm not giving them my room, I repeated firmly. If they don't get their things out, they're going to have to find another place to live. At that moment, Tomas walked in, clearly agitated after hearing the yelling from the hallway. Are you really going to kick us out with a baby on the way? He asked indignantly. What's going on here? I didn't hesitate for a second to answer. What's going on is that your wife thinks she can just take my room without even asking. And I'm telling both of you right now it's not going to happen. You can stay in the guest room, or you can leave. Tomas didn't take it well. He got defensive and started a speech about family, and how I should be willing to sacrifice for them. We have a baby on the way, he insisted. Family should support each other, especially in difficult times. It was exactly the same phrase my mother used to tell me when I was a child and Laura got into trouble. You should be a good sister, Emma, she needs help. Don't be selfish. It was always the same. I always had to give in. But not anymore. I'm already paying for this entire house. I retorted. What are you contributing, huh? Nothing. And now you think you can come here and take my space as if it were yours. The yelling escalated, and it became clear that neither of them was going to back down. My mother tried to intervene, calling my name in a pleading tone, but I turned my back on her, too frustrated to listen to any more excuses. Laura turned abruptly and slammed her bedroom door shut. Tomas just stood there, looking at me as if I were the villain in this whole situation. But I'd had enough. You have until the end of the day to get your things out of my room, I said coldly. If you don't, I will. For the rest of the day, I took refuge in my office trying to calm down. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me in my own house, especially when I was the one paying absolutely everything. I knew that if I went out again, it would only provoke another argument. I didn't want to be a part of that. However, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Laura and Tomas weren't going to give up easily, and I could already feel that my mother would get involved again. But I wasn't going to give in, not this time. The next day, after the blow-up with Laura and Tomas, I hoped that maybe they would finally back down. I had made it clear to them that my room was not up for grabs. They could stay in the guest room or find somewhere else to live. Seemed simple enough to me. Though things didn't quite turn out as I expected, I decided to stay out of it. I wasn't looking for more drama. To be honest, I was still furious about everything that had happened. I worked from the office for most of the day, trying to act as if everything was normal, but the atmosphere in the house was tense. By dinner time, I didn't mind the silence. It seemed everyone was avoiding each other, carefully stepping around the elephant in the room. I could live with Laura and Tomas staying in the guest room if they were finally going to settle down without any more problems. But then something happened that made me snap. That night, I went to the kitchen to make myself dinner as always. I had done all the shopping, but when I opened the fridge, there was almost nothing left. The food I had bought barely 2 days before had vanished. Same with the freezer. I knew my parents didn't eat like that. So who else could it have been? I was already irritated, but I tried to ignore it. I'll buy more tomorrow, I thought. Surely they had taken everything without even asking. But it wasn't just the food. My mother walked into the kitchen without looking me in the eye. I sat at the table, waiting to serve myself when I saw her set plates for Tomas, Laura, my father, and herself, but not for me. At first I thought she had forgotten, so I waited. But no, she simply sat down and began to eat as if nothing was wrong. I couldn't believe it. I felt the anger boiling inside me. I couldn't stay silent any longer. You didn't serve me a plate, I said, staring at her. She barely gave me a glance before shrugging. You don't want to help the family? She replied indifferently, as if she were talking about the weather. So you don't eat with the family? I was speechless. Excuse me. My voice rose without my being able to help it. I pay for everything here. The food, the mortgage. And now I'm excluded from my own home. My father, as always, just sighed and kept eating, pretending nothing was happening. Laura and Tomas had smug smiles, as if they had won some kind of power game. As I passed Laura, she even had the audacity to chuckle. That was it. I wasn't going to allow them to treat me like a stranger in the house that I paid for. My mind was racing. I slammed the refrigerator door shut and walked out of the kitchen with firm steps. I knew exactly what I had to do. I went straight to my room, grabbed my laptop and started searching for eviction forms. If they thought they could disrespect me like this, it was time for them to find another place to live. My patience was over. I wasn't running a free hotel for anyone. In less than an hour, I had the documents ready, 2 copies. One for my parents and one for Laura and Tomas. At this point they had crossed all the lines. For weeks they had disrespected me, acting as if the house belonged to them. I printed the papers and headed to the living room where everyone was sitting, pretending nothing was going on. I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. I didn't say a word when I entered. I just held out the documents. Tomas's face paled when he saw them. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice full of disbelief. "I am completely serious." He stood there staring at me, but I didn't flinch. I was done with this. "You've been living here, contributing nothing, and now you think you can take control of my house? No, not anymore." His anger exploded. "We're family," he spat angrily. But I didn't care anymore. I stood firm, looking at him with determination. I wasn't going to back down because of his tantrum. "We're family, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you walk all over me.
I pay for this house.
Neither you nor Laura nor Mom or Dad. If you can't respect me, you have no right to stay here." As expected, Laura started to cry, trying to make me feel guilty. "I'm pregnant and you're kicking us out. What kind of sister are you?" I didn't hesitate to answer. "I'm the sister who has been paying for everything while you take advantage of me." Tomas seemed ready to keep arguing, but I could see how reality was starting to sink in. He realized that he had crossed a line. "You have 24 hours, I said coldly. "That's more than generous." My mother, who until then had been silent, spoke in a trembling voice. It wasn't weakness, it was manipulation. "You can't do this, honey," she said, gesturing to the eviction notice I had given her. "They're your sister and brother-in-law. We're family." Her tone was the same one she used when I was a child and forced me to give things to Laura. I remembered when I was 13 and they gave me a new bike. A few days later, my mother gave it to Laura because she needed it more. But this time I wasn't going to give in. I already did. "You have 30 days to find another place. If you don't leave in that time, I will take legal action." Absolute silence. My father looked down, avoiding getting involved. My mother's eyes were full of tears, but I didn't care anymore. I turned and went back to my room. This wasn't just about the room anymore. It was about asserting myself and refusing to allow them to continue using me. I locked the door, sat at my desk and took a deep breath. I had just kicked out my own family. Before, that would have seemed unthinkable, but now it felt necessary. The rest of the night, the house was eerily silent. They knew I wasn't playing. No one knocked on my door. No one tried to talk to me. I had set a boundary, and that night I slept better than I had slept in months. The next morning I lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Today was the day. Laura and Tomas had 24 hours. For the first time in weeks I didn't feel angry. It was no longer about emotions, it was about taking action. When I came out of my room and entered the kitchen, I felt the difference. The tension was gone. Only the calm before the storm remained. I made myself breakfast with what little was left in the fridge. While I ate, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had fallen apart. Not long ago, things were going well. I worked, paid the mortgage, the groceries, and life went on its course. Then Laura and Tomas arrived, and everything went to hell. A couple of hours later, my father entered the kitchen, made some coffee, and sat down silently. Finally, he spoke. "Laura and Tomas are leaving today." I nodded without saying anything. Then he added in a low voice, "They have nowhere to go." I paused and looked at him. "They're staying in a motel until they get themselves sorted out," he continued, as if I cared. I knew this had to happen. I had been too lenient, and if I didn't set boundaries, they would continue taking advantage. They had their chance. If they can't respect me, they don't belong here. My father didn't argue or try to make me feel guilty. He just nodded and took another sip of coffee. He knew at that moment that I wasn't going to back down. By midday they began packing. I stayed in my room to avoid further conflict, but shortly after, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, I found Tomas red with anger. Are you really going to let this happen? You're going to kick us out like this. I crossed my arms, staring at him without flinching. I gave you 24 hours. You knew what you had to do. Tomas shook his head, gritting his teeth. We're family. You don't do this to family. I took a deep breath, holding my ground. Family doesn't take advantage of each other. I've paid for everything while you've just taken. And instead of being grateful, you tried to kick me out of my own house. I'm not going to allow it. I could see Tomas's frustration building. He opened his mouth to argue more, but at that moment, I knew he was running out of arguments. Reality had hit him. So that's it, huh? You're kicking us out. I didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, that's right. Tomas stared at me for a few more seconds before turning around and walking away without another word. You can find another place to live. Or you can stay in the guest room and respect me and my space. If you can't do that, then yes, you're leaving. I sighed deeply and closed the door behind me. I knew it was the right thing to do, but emotionally it left me exhausted. By mid-afternoon, Laura and Tomas were gone. I didn't expect emotional goodbyes, and I didn't get them. The house felt different when they left, calmer, less pressure in the air. They packed up, loaded the car, and drove away without saying a word to me. That day my parents barely spoke. They were still absorbing everything that had happened. My mother, though she didn't say it, looked upset. Perhaps for the first time, she was starting to realize that I wasn't the villain in this story. That night, my mother knocked on my bedroom door. Laura and Tomas pushed me too far, she whispered, coming in and sitting on the edge of my bed. She stared at the floor for a long while, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke again, this time with a tone of guilt. I never thought we'd get to this point. I watched her silently, realizing how much weight they had placed on my shoulders. It's not that I didn't want to help, I replied. But you acted as if I didn't matter, as if my needs and my space weren't worth anything. She sighed and nodded slowly. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of everything hanging in the air. Finally, I broke the silence. I don't want you and Dad to leave, I admitted. She seemed uneasy, but at least now she understood my position better. But if things don't change, I can't keep living like this, I added. She nodded again and stood up slowly. We'll fix it, she promised. Things will be different. I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion as she left the room. The problem with Laura and Tomas was resolved, but I knew there was still a lot to work through with my parents. It wouldn't be easy, but at least now they seemed willing to listen. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The house was quiet. The tension that had been suffocating us was finally gone. I finally had my space back. It wasn't a perfect solution, but the most important thing was that I had regained my respect. Looking back, I understood that sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to protect yourself, even if it means defying family expectations. It's about setting boundaries and demanding the respect you deserve, not about being selfish. Sitting in my room, finally alone and at peace, I couldn't help but feel proud. I didn't know what would happen with my relationship with Laura, Tomas, or even my parents, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never again let anyone take advantage of me, family or not. I had stood up for my right to decide, I had spoken my truth, and I had taken back control of my life. My life wasn't perfect, and it had never been easy, but it was mine, and that changed everything. As I went to bed that night, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Whatever tomorrow brought, I was ready to face it with renewed strength and a self-respect that no one, not even my family, could take away from me.